for those of us interested in intellectual histories and political thought of South Asia, for a long time, the kind of work that we focused on was centered around great men. So when we were trying to move beyond the great men histories, we encountered a few roadblocks, and the roadblocks were that the great men histories essentially spoke to issues of access and a canon, a preset canon, which had preceded the Indian independence. So essentially, this workshop trying to rethink the canons. There was a decanonical attempt here, but there was also an attempt to focus more on vernacular sources beyond the usual collected volumes, speeches, and the collected works kind of thing, and to move beyond the canonical thinkers and to think of intellectual alterities, not forgetting global entanglements, but also not making those we think with a certain globality to their thought as the only reason to focus on them as thinkers of modern India, so to speak. And so we started this. When we started this, we thought that while there is a large focus on grand theories for a long time, there was a need for renewed focus on the everyday political. So in the face of right-wing populism, we think that the everyday political needs to be focused on, needs to be dealt with, and needs to be researched, especially by historians, as much as sociologists and anthropologists and others. So yeah, so this is a commingling of these ideas, so to speak. I think I'll start without further ado because people are joining and they'll continue to join. So the panel has been titled Continuity and Rupture in Statecraft. We have 4 papers. Everybody would have an allotted time of 20 minutes. It's the responsibility of our discussant, Dr. Pratim Shil, to ensure that the discussants stick to the 20 minutes. And after that, our chair, Professor Sugata Bose, would be in charge of setting the structure of who comments when, and then when the Q&A starts. So I will introduce our chair and discussant for the day and leave the floor to them. Our chair, Professor Sugata Bose, is Gardner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs. Professor Bose is at Harvard University. Professor Bose's field of specialization is modern South Asia and Indian Ocean history. He obtained his PhD from the University of Cambridge. Amongst his many books, some are His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggle Against Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2011, and 100 Horizons, The Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, published by Harvard University Press in 2006. In 100 Horizons, Professor Bose crosses area studies and disciplinary frontiers as he bridges the domains of political economy and culture. He was a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1997. Professor Bose is currently writing a book titled Asia After Europe, Decline and Rise of a Continent. I think this has been published. Yeah, this has been published, I think, Asia After Europe, Decline and Rise of a Continent. This was... you're muted. Professor Bose, you're muted.
Yes, I'm just finishing it up this summer.
Okay, yeah, you're finishing it up this summer. I probably saw the front cover. Is the design or something is out, I think.
You may have seen a lecture on the subject that I may have given and so forth, yeah.
Yes. And he's also general editor on the Cambridge History of the Indian Ocean. Our discussant for the day is Dr. Pratim Shil. He's a historian of modern South Asia who works on state formation in colonial Eastern India through a history of security workers at the lowest rungs of the colonial state, such as police constables and village watchmen. Dr. Shil finished his PhD at the Faculty of History, University of Cambridge in 2017. Dr. Shil's doctoral dissertation entitled Police Labor and State Formation in Bengal circa 1860-1950 was shortlisted for the Bailey Prize 2018. Currently, Dr. Shil is working on a book manuscript provisionally entitled Sovereign Labor and the Making of the Modern State in Eastern India circa 1860-1950. So over to Professor Bose to begin the plenary.
Thank you very much, Rohit, for inviting me to chair this session of your conference. I welcome this opportunity to learn more about what younger scholars are working on, their new modes of thinking. So I'm really looking forward to listening to these 4 papers in this session. The panel is titled Continuity and Rupture in Statecraft. Dr. Pratim Shil of the University of Cambridge is the discussant. It's always nostalgic for me to be back in Cambridge, even virtually. I did my PhD there on agrarian history under the supervision of Eric Stokes, and also, got to know Chris Bailey very well at that time. I was at St. Catherine's College, both as a graduate student and then as a fellow for 3 years before crossing the Atlantic. The first paper will be given by Avarna Ojha. The title of the paper is Establishing Corruption from Mid-19th Century to the 20th Century. Avarna is based in Delhi, and she graduated from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in 2017. So, Avarna, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Bose, for sharing that. I think it's interesting to know how you feel about reconnecting virtually. And of course, thank you to all the organizers and co-panelists for bringing this entire session to life. I think it's been a very interesting day, and I'm looking forward to the coming sessions as well. Just to begin, to give a few idea, I think overarchingly, I'll be trying to understand corruption or the idea of it in transitory states. And essentially, I've used a few official documents from colonial and post-colonial era to understand how corruption was constructed and perceived in the political and public arena. Um, I hope you're all able to see my screen, by the way. Sorry, I started off before asking that. Okay, wonderful. Um, so, of course, corruption is a very contested topic, and I would say that most scholars have tried to understand it in order to understand how it can be antithesis to effective governance. But largely, it can be an economic transaction, it can be a cultural phenomena, it can be a politically induced norm, it can even be simply a legitimate act, but it can, again, also be a vehicle of economic opportunity or simply a tool to reinforce or enforce tools of social oppression. Clearly, many different varied definitions are existing, but largely historians have come to understand that corruption or definition of corruption is based on the context, the situation, the place, and of course the changing form of jurisdiction. I would say overall it falls in the ambit of law, morality, and society. Um, as Professor Bose had mentioned, my paper largely falls or tries to understand the very long time of 19th and 20th century. And this was a period when India was undergoing British rule for sure. And in the initial years, it was, of course, governed by the English East India Company, especially by the triangular post of Madras, Calcutta, and Bengal. And of course, as it moved from a trading company to a governing system, a very large bureaucratic structure came up with young British and subordinate native officials sort of taking over the task. And largely their uh, work was directed towards revenue accumulation. And this period was also a period of a lot of anxiety, especially regarding mismanagement, since it was a new governing system. And of course, there was also a clashing Anglo and customary legal framework. There's a lot of tension happening in the situation. And in order to sort of claim legitimacy, the EIC officials often chose to lay blame of mismanagement on certain social groups. In this particular context, I would say it's the subordinate native officials who became the site of target of laying blame. And overall, in a way, they were used as a site to say that they are either criminal or even more so, they are corrupt, whether it's morally or economically or culturally. Um, and this, of course, this whole trend, which I'm describing right now, is very much evident in the textual records that would come from the English East India Company fortified settlements, whether it's Madras or England or otherwise. So before I move to those particular textual records, I will just try to give an overarching idea of how even theorists across time have perceived corruption. So as I said, it's essentially understood in light of how to formulate better governing policies. Some have seen it from a state level, others have tried to understand from provincial level. There's also like currently there's also a movement happening to understand it as a structural misconduct. For instance, Paul Kenny has studied it as how it was operating within the Indian civil services. Elias Chatta has tried to understand it in the continuity in the vestiges of the British Empire. Um, and besides academic circle, I think international institutions like Transparency International or Anti-Corp has tried to also bring it down to the idea that it is abuse of public office for private gain. So, I mean, we can see the idea that, of course, corruption is brought down to the tool of what how it's operating within political arena, and I'll in a way also be following this train of thought as I go into particular specific case studies. Um, so, as I mentioned, throughout its rule, the English East India Company, which I think I like to now refer to as EIC, was frequently accused of political corruption. If I have to explain exactly what political corruption is, it would essentially be seen as individuals collecting revenue through offices you establish for public benefit. Fairly often, the same individuals that were performing these acts of corruption were also the ones who were trying to, in a way, define what corruption is, whether it's through a legal arena or through a governing system. Um, I can explain this better by quoting Thomas Munro, who said that it was better to blame natives rather than ourselves for any act of corruption. Um, there's, of course, all by this period, I mean the 19th century, there's, of course, this very clear link that corruption is seen not through the act itself or the factors that are enabling it, but there's a very strong concern that it is playing a role in the moral decay of society. And of course, it's also influencing how the EIC's reputation is shaped, whether it's in England or whether it's in the colonies. And that's really the concern point. For instance, I think we are in a way familiar with the Edmund Burke's impeachment of Warren Hastings. He was the Governor General and he was accused of corruption. And if you go through the impeachment, there's a huge, huge concern in England regarding how people who are blamed for corruption in a way ruin the company's reputation, especially if they are colonial officials. I would strongly say that the East India Company officials showed very high level of corruption and apathy towards anti-corruption measures. In a way, in this period, there was more or less an acceptance and a normalization of the idea and the practice of any corrupt activity. But despite that, there's also a very significant reaction against any acrimonious act performed by native officials, especially in the metropole. Um, and as I would be going further, I would like to show the fact that this contemporary forms of corruption is certainly mirroring what was happening in EIC in this period. I mean, of course, as many theorists have argued, India is still living in the shadows of post-colonialism, and this is very much evident in the realm of corruption as well. Um, for instance, one second. Um, thank you. For instance, EIC really gave prominence to bribery, and it became the most notorious form of corruption in this period. There was a lot of concern regarding that. And of course, EIC also, in a way, argued that transparency and accountability can be achieved through documentation. I mean, there are also many other predominant prejudices that were emerging from this period. For instance, there's a certain classification happening in the social hierarchy where certain groups are blamed for being more corrupt than others. In this case, of course, subordinate native officials. And this kind of trend is very much visible in the contemporary era as well. And beyond what I mean, AIC was also doing, there's of course certain context that I would like to refer to that was in a way shaping the way EIC officials were also thinking, but also the way the public was perceiving what EIC was in a way trying to perpetuate. And there are certain measures that I would like to talk about. I would say, for instance, essentially they are like I would just like to like in a way go over two predominant examples. One being, of course, the very famous Adam Smith. I mean, he was a very influential thinker of the 18th century, and he really talked about economic man being driven by self-interest and rational choices. In his theory of the theory of moral sentiments, he says that power, respect, and social position can be achieved through economic improvement. Also, in his Wealth of Nation, he's very much provide a powerful justification of economic pursuit being the highest point of individual self-interest. And around this time, other influential ideas like economic liberalization, minimum intervention by the government in the market, and limited legal check on transactions very heavily influenced Britain's policies. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a very strong indication that corruption is an act of by individuals. There is not so much accountability by structure to actually enable it. And of course, in the realm of law, there are many policies that are emerging. I mean, there's a strong interest, even as early as the late 18th century in corruption, especially after 1770s, which was a time when the Bengal famine happened. There's a very growing concern regarding the EIC's governing capabilities in London. And in the British Parliament, for instance, in 1772, a select committee is appointed and they tend to investigate what was happening in EIC. And as a result, they came up with the Regulating Act in 1773, which very clearly underlined that bribery is the most pervasive form of corruption. This is what we really would like to focus on. Um, Also noticeably, the Act says that it's unlawful for the company officials to accept presents from the native. I mean, from these provisions, it's very clear that one, corruption becomes a prerogative of the subcontinent, whether it's like to say that it's only the natives who will be, in a way, giving or encouraging bribes. And of course, there's a very strong concern with the reputation of the company and whether it's actually being able to administer the colony effectively. Um, of course, measures such as the Regulating Act, which I'm referring to, or the Indian Act of 1784, which also refer to corruption, have very limited aspects of controlling or in a way eradicating or in a way punishing corrupt activities. There's a lot of ambiguity regarding that. There's much more concern about how revenue is to be accumulated, whether the direction should be only towards the EIC or towards the crown and not so much towards the natives. That's really the overarching theme that is in a way regulating these legal policies on corruption. To understand this very large trends in a more sharpened way, I would be trying to go into one specific report that I came across, and that is something which I will be titling as the Madras Dispatch. Um, so, of course, as we know, Madras came into existence in by 1785 through the Piss India Act, and it was seen before, but this is when it was labeled as Madras. And the fortified settlement of British Empire was the Fort St. George, and between Fort St. George and England, many correspondences were exchanged, including the one which I'm referring to, which is the Madras Dispatch of 1816 to 1821. In a way, it revealed that EIC officials were heavily involved in corrupt activities. In the This is like a series of reports being going through and for, and in the initial report which I saw, which is by lesser known of colonial officials like E. Parry and I. Inglis, they have in a way expressed very strong anxiety regarding the frequent occurrences of corrupt activities in different levels of the revenue department of EIC. They're also lamenting the lack of adequate measures to control corruption. In response, a special commission is appointed in England, which consists of John Sullivan, who is a district collector of Coimbatore, and Colonel Thomas Munro, who would later on become the governor of Madras in 1819. And the commission's findings are, of course, that there's an extensive amount of corruption being laid out, especially bribery. Corruption is labeled as an evil that is infecting the subcontinent. There's a very strong indication that native servants are the ones carrying out most activities of corruption. And of course, a lot of measures are proposed to prevent corruption. So, to alter the morals of people, the Special Commission urged for a few legislation. One was, of course, to grant more power to the company officials to detect cases of corruption and recover the amount stolen from the company's revenue department. The second remedy is to create incentives specifically for native officials to deter them from indulging in corruption, like giving them higher salary or creating a pension plan for them, and even to confer honorary distinctions to support to promote or to celebrate the fidelity of native servants. Very clearly, the colonial officials' measures are twofold. One is to, of course, control the direction of revenue, to use corruption as a tool to do that. And secondly, there's more of a concern towards preventing acts of corruption rather than punishing it, because, of course, it's all laid in a way to responsibility of native servants and not so much of the all colonial officials that must be surely indulging in these particular activities. And of course, I mean, as we know, AIC's motives was very much under the veil of the white man's burden. I would strongly say that corruption as a practice is not limited only to the actions of few individuals in any particular given time. It's an ongoing process which is often stimulated when an institution deviates from the ethical boundaries it has set for itself. So for AIC, of course, the ethical boundary was shaped by its concern for revenue accumulation and for protecting its own reputation. And certainly, the subcontinent was the root for all corrupt practices in its discourse, and colonial officials were absolved of all blame. And the idea was to, in a way, reform native behavior and morals. I mean, corruption was very much brought down to these three different nexus, I would say. And the Madras report is very clearly written at a time when AIC is trying to stronghold its governing institution. It's definitely coming up with many new policies that is going to be carried forward even when the crown is controlling India, and of course also in post-independent India. So it's very indicative of the discourse surrounding corruption, especially its lack of initiative to, in a way, punish. It's mostly concerned with preventing it, and it's not a coincidence that bribery emerges as the overarching, uh, I would say, aspect of corruption that's everyone's concern all of a sudden. And oh, sorry, one second. It, and of course, I mean, the Madras dispatch is not the only so-called case which has of corruption that's been reported around this time, right? I mean, uh, as Lord Acton had said, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. I mean, this is very much visible in the case study of Arthur Crawford. So, Nut Auckland actually had studied this, and he calls it the Crawford scandal of 1889. Arthur Crawford is a colonial official, and he's accused of corrupt activities, and as a result, he's suspended from his post in colonial India, sent back to London, and after a few years, he's posted again in a different area in colonial India. So it's very evident that AIC is only concerned about not so much the corrupt activity, it's only concerned about reputation of how corruption will have on accusation of corruption will have on it. And it's very much absolving current officials of any wrongdoing. Um, so as I said, I mean, of course, there is a very, I mean, from what I understood, there's a very clear continuity happening also in the post-independent India. I mean, especially around, I would say, 1947, which is when the first policy on anti-corruption was emerging. And this is once again a period when the state is in transition, a new governing body is being established. There's a lot of anxiety about having a stable ground, trying to claim legitimacy, and of course, corruption once again becomes a political tool of contestation in a way. Um, and when I went through the Prevention of Corruption Act, once again noticeably, bribery emerged as the key concern area. I mean, other forms of corruption were pretty much relegated to the uh, margins, I would say. And of course, the Prevention of Corruption Act is influenced also by the Code of Criminal Procedure of 1898, again, a criminal policy, so it's not very surprising. And there's a very clear line which says that the act of receiving and or giving illegal remuneration is what we would consider as corruption. There's a very strong emphasis on scrutinizing the activities of public servants as well. So, I mean, of course, the concern is a lot to do with the reputation of the governing body and not so much with the act or the factors enabling corruption. So, I mean, in fact, as Guru Harpal Singh had even noted, even Prime Minister Nehru recognized the power of popular sentiments and wished to control the social climate or discourse surrounding corruption. Nehru is quoted saying that merely shouting from the roofs that everybody's corrupt creates an atmosphere of corruption. People feel that they are in a climate of corruption and they can get corrupted themselves. So the idea is not to focus so much on the transaction, the transgression, or any of it. It's just the idea that how does it impact the reputation of a governing body, and how do we control it through controlling social governance, or to control it through controlling behavior of society. Um, I would just like to show a simple quote, I think, which reinforces my point. Yeah, it's pretty clear that bribery is the concern point for anybody engaging in corruption, especially from a political and a legal perspective. And that's really the idea which does percolate down even beyond institutions, of course, in both the 19th century and in the 20th century. Um, there's another report that also came out in the 60s, which was the time when I think there were debate session happening between the members of parliaments, and the a strong concern was expressed regarding corruption, especially in the administrative setup of the government. And as a result, the committee was appointed to assess and, in a way, to envisage measures to prevent corruption. And once again, the recommendation which they proposed are starkly similar to the one that was proposed in the Madras report of 1818. Um, the committee, for instance, recommend policies to eradicate corruption by changing the social climate, by changing controlling the behavior of the officials. There's a very strong emphasis on revenue accumulation. In fact, the committee actually visits particular organization like the income tax, the excise, the custom officers, and that's where they situate corruption. There's the underlying definition that
Anna,
corruption
you
was
have
improper.
1 minute left. Sorry, you
Oh,
have 1 minute left.
really? Okay, well, I'm almost done, but thank you, Parth. And yeah, as I was saying, there's of course the idea that corruption is improper, it's selfish, and there's a very strong concern that it's linked to the idea of public office. In fact, it says that it was reported to us that corruption was increased to such an extent that people have started losing faith in the integrity of public administration. Evidently, there's a huge concern with how corruption is seen as, in a way, sorry, lost my train of thought. In a way, it's trying to prevent or it's trying to influence the reputation of the governing bodies. And there's, of course, a very strong emphasis on how it will impact the direction of revenue flow. So, as Parth has said, I think we're almost done. So, I'll just have some concluding remarks. I mean, these few government documents, which I picked up specifically from the time when the states was changing, they reveal a very clear continuity. There's, of course, heightened focus on bribery. There's a growing anxiety to improve governance and administrative control, and there's a very clear demarcation about specific group carrying the responsibility of corruption. Sorry, I forgot one point. In the 1964 report, there's a very clear line that the social group of commercial and industrial classes are the one who are most prone to be corrupt. So once again, like back then, it was about officials. Now we have another particular group emerging that are kind of responsibility of corruption. Um, but largely, as we would like to say, I think even though it's pervasive, it's important to recognize the fact that the whole idea, discourse, and definition of corruption is very much dependent on the context it's operating in, and is defined also by influential individuals, and they are really the one who are, in a way, still using it as a tool to accumulate revenue and as a way of tool to assert power. And that's really what it boils down. So I will not go into a lot of detail. I'd like to continue this more in the comment section if that emerges. But of course, I'd like to end the discussion by just thanking Parth and Professor Bose and Dr. Roy for organizing this. This was absolutely incredible. And thank you for everyone for listening so patiently. And looking forward to any comments you may have. I hope I'm much in time now, and I look forward to other questions.
Thank you very much, Avarna, for your paper. And yes, we will return to a proper discussion of your presentation later. For the moment, let me just note that I think we need to keep a distinction in mind between corruption as it applies to colonial officials in general, and another kind of corruption that came to be seen almost as an Indian character trait. And here, looking at the 18th century, I think it's worth mentioning that even though Warren Hastings was charged with corruption by Edmund Burke, or even before that, the Regulating Act was beginning to see private trade on the part of company officials as a challenge to the corporate authority of the company. It wasn't really until the Cornwallis era and then the early 19th century, as you show from your Madras example, that this connection came to be forged between Indian or quote unquote native officials being particularly susceptible to corruption. But we'll return to all of that. Let's now move on to the second paper on this panel. Saawani Raje-Byrne is a lecturer at the King's College London Defence Studies Department, where she teaches the military and civil servants from the UK and abroad. She was awarded her PhD from King's College earlier this year. Her thesis is titled Decisions in Crises, A History of Indian Civil-Military Relations, 1947 to 1971. The title of her paper is Legacies of the Raj, the Making of Civil-Military Relations in India. Saawani.
Hello, sorry, my internet keeps going, so it just cut out. But I'm back
We can hear
now.
you now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure this out. Can you see the presentation? Can everyone see it? Okay, thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, no, you can see my paper here. So, sorry about this. Is this going? Okay. So basically today I'm just going to talk about, it's a paper I've sort of thought about, and I'm trying to just test out feedback and any critique on this. So on the 25th of October in 1947, so quite soon after independence, a large band of tribal militias captured and destroyed the Mahura power station in Jammu and Kashmir. It's here near Uri. So the destruction of this power station, which did supply power to Srinagar, plunged the capital of Jammu and Kashmir into darkness. In events that are now quite well known, Maharaja Hari Singh fled to the plains of Jammu and eventually contacted Indian officials and signed the instrument of accession. This made Jammu and Kashmir officially a part of India. Events following from there eventually led to the first Kashmir War between India and Pakistan, which was barely a couple of months after the two nations became independent. For the leadership of both nations, this was a trial by fire, essentially. They had to grapple with a 14-month-long sort of full-blown military confrontation while undergoing partition, the division of assets, and the establishment of institutions and polities, essentially. So what I want to do today is examine the colonial legacies of Indian civil-military relations, and then offer a very brief glimpse into how these legacies influenced civil-military interaction during the First Kashmir War. So I argue that civil-military relations in India at independence were mainly influenced by three factors. So first was the implementation of British recruitment policies, which essentially alienated the British Indian Army as an institution from nationalism and wider society. Secondly, the formation and the defeat of the Indian National Army and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny. And both of these raised quite serious issues about the loyalty and politicization of armed forces. And then finally, the nationalization of the armed forces and their division into the defense establishments of India and Pakistan had an impact as well. This had quite lasting effects on trust within the military institution, but also raised questions about military capability. And so this actually influenced how Indian civilian and military elites approached the first Kashmir War after independence. So what I'm going to do is first examine those three issues before coming to the first Kashmir War. So British recruitment policies, as I said before, played a very big role in influencing the British Indian Army's command structure. They contributed towards creating an atmosphere of unease and mistrust between the leaders of the Indian nationalist movement and the army itself. And this sense of unease lasted, I'm arguing, through independence and beyond. So the army in India was recruited on the basis of the martial race theory, which basically argued that some classes were better fighters than the others. Unsurprisingly, this theory had gained credence within colonial circles after the 1857 uprising. And the focus was creating these martial communities. You can see these examples here, which was, potential recruits were made to be socially invested in the martial honor of their communities, What this meant was it ensured military professionalism and loyalty towards the British on one hand, but also insulated the military as an institution from the nationalist movement on the other hand. This principle saw some success. First, the military recruits began to be drawn from a narrow range of communities. So by 1930, for example, Punjab accounted for 54% of all of the army's recruits. Secondly, and I guess perhaps deliberate result of this, was the development of an apolitical feeling of community within the army to a certain extent. The loyalty of these Indian soldiers lay primarily with their regiments or their units, and isolating them from feeling solidarity with political upheavals against the British that go on. Thirdly, and quite interestingly and significantly, these apolitical British forces were used to quell nationalist violence in the 30s and the 40s. And as a result, what happened was this military became increasingly alienated from the nationalist leadership, intensifying feelings of distrust. Motilal Nehru sums up this discomfort quite effectively. He says, "Our army is a mercenary army employed by foreigners to put down their own countrymen and keep them under foreign heels." In addition to that, the outbreak of the Second World War actually exacerbated tensions. India was co-opted into the war effort without much real consultation with the main political parties involved. The army, which was actively involved in the war, was once again seen as the most obvious representation of colonial repression. This triggered a power struggle between the Indian national leadership and the British. For Indian leaders, control over defense and the military was inextricably linked with concepts of independence, sovereignty, and subjugation. The military's significance in defense and control of the territory could not be questioned. A necessary precondition, so, to considering India sovereign was Indian and not British control over its defense administration. So the British recruitment policies and the tug of war during the Second World War led to a gradual alienation of civilian leaders from the military and reinforced the need to control Indian defense as a marker of true political sovereignty. Now, this, as I will try and come to later, influenced the future civilian leadership's behavior towards the military during the war after independence, particularly when they viewed strong civilian control over the military as a sort of primary foundational factor in all of their interactions. Next, we come to questions of loyalty. So, the late 1930s and the early 1940s also saw an emerging debate about loyalty, politicization, and professionalism of the armed forces. And this was thrust into sharper relief with the formation and defeat of the Indian National Army and the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny, which was in 1945-1946. So the INA, as we know, was a nationalist force made up of 40,000 men and women, mainly prisoners of war in Japan. They marched to Delhi under Subhash Chandra Bose, but were completely routed by the British Indian Army by mid-1945. And these captured INA troops were then put under trial for waging war against the King Emperor. The subsequent INA trials in 1945 and 46 actually raised very crucial questions about the politicization of the armed forces. Jawaharlal Nehru was an important voice in this debate, as he led the defense trials and the defense team with Bhulabhai Desai. So his writings about the INA, if you think about his intellectual journey, started off with very strong opposition to it. So for example, in August 1945, he called the members of the Indian National Army misguided. And he said these people had to be resisted in India or outside. However, then he moved to co-opting the INA into broader nationalist struggles. So he led the defense stream at the trials, as I said, and argued, as I've said, if owing to some technical interpretation of military law, large numbers of them, which is INA prisoners, received severe sentences, it would be a tragedy for India. So the INA had now turned into one of the most significant symbols of nationalism. It was in effect used as a bargaining counter in larger political negotiations with British decision makers as well to score nationalist political points. The British response to this, however, was considerably harsher. Viceroy Wavell thought it was an act of folly for nationalist parties to glorify the INA. Commander-in-Chief Auchin Leck also opposed the release of the captured INA troops. He wrote to defense member Baldev Singh actually that Indian officers in the British Indian Army would regard this release as the thin edge of the wedge and become increasingly nervous about their own future prospects. However, political expediency won over concerns about military professionalism. Reluctant to inflame nationalistic tensions further, the British discontinued INA trials. Now, these tensions surrounding the INA trials were exacerbated by a mutiny and vandalism on board the HIMS Talwar, which started off with a painting of anti-imperial resistance slogans in December 1945. And then it escalated to violence that spread across the Bombay docks by February 1946. The use of the INA in nationalist rhetoric had actually influenced Indian ratings, who were junior sailors on board the HIMS Talwar, to embark on a hunger strike and then eventually move them to mutiny. However, and this is interesting, in contrast to Nehru and the general nationalist leadership support for the INA, the Royal Indian Navy mutineers were largely met by silence or quite quiet advice. In fact, Vallabhbhai Patel and Mahatma Gandhi sought to end this mutiny because they saw it as representing a threat to the transfer of power negotiations between the British and the Congress. The Congress's wariness towards the mutiny and the political action by the members of the Royal Indian Navy actually set the precedent for stronger civilian control of the military in independent India. So in the years after independence, for example, military units were strongly discouraged from taking independent political action of any kind. And it was done to sort of mitigate the threat that the military posed to the Indian state. So having used the military as tools of political expediency, civilian leaders themselves seemed wary of the armed forces when they became politicized. These concerns about loyalty were reflected in the extent of control that were exerted by Indian civilian leaders on the military during the war, and I'll come to that later. There were questions of loyalty, there were questions of alienation, but the third factor that influenced civil-military relations in India during this phase was the transformation of the military as an institution itself. And this happened through two processes, nationalization and the division of assets. Now, just before the First World War, the British government had realized that there was a shortage of troops and officer cadre in the Indian Army, which threatened to hamper the broader war effort. So to combat this shortage, something called a King's Commission for selected Indian officers and the Viceroy's Commission for non-commissioned officers was introduced. This was a significant shake-up of the British Indian Army because for most of British colonial history in India, Indian troops had always served under British officers. Now, this sort of move towards nationalization actually continued even after the war, and the first batch of Indian recruits started their training at Sandhurst in 1920. By 1932, the Indian Military Academy had been opened in Dehradun to accommodate the rising number of Indian officers. But this policy of nationalization actually really gained momentum during the Second World War. There was an acute shortage of the officer base. There's a strong push from the Commander-in-Chief Auchinleck, and also subsequent British plans for the transfer of power all contributed to this. The intent to create a completely national army, officered and manned throughout by Indians, was announced as a major component of the British transfer of power policy in 1939. The goal was to achieve this in the shortest possible space of time. And this was in tandem with India's future political leadership as well. For them, nationalization was a primary concern. Nehru, for example, aimed for a completely nationalized defense forces from the outset of independence. And this went back to the thinking about whoever controls the army controls the state. However, there was a significant concern at the speed with which nationalization was pushed through. Often, Indians promoted to officership to make up numbers did not always have the adequate training and experience. Struggling between political pressure to nationalize and the military compulsion for quality, Commander-in-Chief Auchinleck eventually accelerated promotions of some Indian officers, who within the military had not really progressed beyond the rank of brigadier. And some officers had less than 8 years' experience in the army as a whole. However, nationalization was pushed through, and what it left in its wake was questions about the numbers and quality of the military leadership. A direct result of this was, at independence, the Indian Armed Forces faced a severe shortage of trained officers. And this was especially felt in the higher levels of military leadership. And the commander-in-chiefs of both India and Pakistan after independence, the first commander-in-chiefs, were British. So while nationalization was responsible for starting a process that would change the structure and the composition of the Indian army, the partition of the subcontinent was a bigger blow to the armed forces. It came obviously at the cost of millions of lives, the division of a strong army, and a very chaotic split of the defense infrastructure as a whole. It left a militarily weakened defense structure and an army that had been very hastily split in two. The commander-in-chief Auchin Leck actually said, "The army could barely stand nationalization alone. If it was also divided, it would be killed stone dead." Now, within this, it's important to realize that for the British, the army was more than having to nationalize it and giving it to the independent Indian state. It figured in their broader strategic aims for the subcontinent as a sort of buffer for the region east of Suez and a sort of important defense post. So all of these opinions were coming through that view. And then again, with the final transfer of power date being brought forward to the 15th of August 1947, officers who were commanding the Indian military learned that they had 11 weeks to divide the entire defense establishment of British India into two successive forces. So partition of the forces also meant the partition of the entire defense establishment. And it threw up unexpected problems. For example, none of the essential armament producing plants lay in Pakistan, and all the technical supervisors in such plants were British, and who were all supposed to return to the UK by February 1948. Now, the skilled workers for such establishment were gathered from local areas. But out of the nearly 4,000 employees for ordnance factories in India, only about 400 to 500 actually requested transfers to Pakistan. And so this entire process kept proving to be increasingly complex. And then the communal violence that rocked both states during partition meant that between reconstitution, nationalization, division, and managing the violence, the armed forces were stretched extremely thin. This was made worse by the First Kashmir War that then broke out literally 2 months after independence, which influenced the Indian Armed Forces' capability to respond militarily. So the story of civil-military relations in India during the transfer of power can be retold as one of a civilian leadership who was suspicious of the military, but acknowledged the importance of complete civilian control, the hasty reconstitution and transformation of an armed forces who were facing a serious lack of trained and experienced leadership, and this overall sense of discomfort and disorganization. So these colonial legacies of oppression and distrust greatly influenced civilian behavior vis-a-vis the military in the next couple of months. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples highlighting these themes, but very happy to talk about it in more detail afterwards. So India and Pakistan were still undergoing the division of assets, restructuring of their defense infrastructures, when the tribal raiders attacked Mahura on 25th October 1947. Now, as we all know, throughout September and October, Hari Singh was engaged in negotiations with India to secure the accession of Jammu and Kashmir on favorable terms. With the attack on Mahura, he abandoned all his demands and requested India for military assistance. The decisions and events that followed brought India and Pakistan to war with each other. After Hari Singh asked for military assistance, the Indian Commander-in-Chief, Rob Lockhart, argued that sending a battalion of Indian troops to help the Jammu and Kashmir state forces was a considerable military risk. The division of assets during partition had led to a really severe shortfall in military equipment available to Indian Army to do that. Now, whether India could spare arms or ammunition or troops for a military engagement in Kashmir was a recurring concern voiced by the military leadership throughout this war. However, for the civilian leadership, this crisis was about the importance of Kashmir becoming a part of India.
Saawani, you have 1 minute left. I'm sorry. You have 1 minute.
I'm going to finish. 2 minutes. And for Nehru, Kashmir was about the larger strategic questions, showing that India was a viable secular state. Also, interestingly, if India managed to have military victory over Pakistan, it could be a signal towards the strength of India as a newly independent nation. So the importance of Kashmir remaining in India became completely central to the whole experience. The alienation and the power struggles from the Second World War and the transfer of power had meant that the Indian civilian leadership saw extreme civilian control as completely necessary. So even the operational domain, which was considered a military area, was completely controlled by the civilians, and they kept directing the military operationally. I will just wrap up and basically say not just that, and I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A, but within the military as well, the effects of nationalization and the fact that you had this, what was seen by the British as an incapable army, essentially, meant that there's tension within the ranks of the military as well, so that the higher level and then the second rung of officers who are all Indian led to disagreements about what to do in Kashmir. And that sort of set the tone of what the army, the civilians and the military would want to fight about throughout. And you can see that in the decades after, in the Second Kashmir War, in the war against China, in the Bangladesh War. And so what I just want to end at is by saying that colonial inheritances that were, that were entrenched during the transfer of power and before that, influenced civil-military relations in India at the dawn of independence. It was a continuous process where we not only inherited the defense infrastructure and institutions, but the attitudes, perceptions, and relationships that led to decision-making and management of this war. And I will end with that, but happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saawani, for that fascinating paper on the colonial inheritance of the tenor of civil-military relations post 1947. During the first Kashmir War, both the Indian and the Pakistani armies were being commanded by British military officers and fighting the war using Second World War junk, which enabled the British to scale down the sterling balances owed to both India and Pakistan. And during the negotiation for division of assets, there were some ridiculous exchanges. If you read the early chapter of Ayesha Jalal's The State of Martial Rule, the Indian side had offered number 3 military boots to Pakistan, which Pakistan thought was an expression of bad faith. And then India responded saying that, well, we could have used these boots for our Gorkha soldiers, so, this wasn't an expression of bad faith after all. But we'll come back to, the broader argument that you are making about a certain degree of continuity between the colonial and post-colonial eras when it came to civil-military relations during discussion. For now, we'll move on to the third paper, which is by Yasser Ali Nasser, who's a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Chicago, and he's working on the emergence of discourses of Sino-Indian friendship in the 1950s. Before coming to the United States, he was an undergraduate at Durham University and also a graduate student at the University of Oxford. His paper is titled Making Friends and Making Asia, The Aspirations of Sino-Indian Friendship, 1949 to 1956. Yasser.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Okay. So hello everyone. Thank you for being here at such a busy time, and thank you to Rohit and all the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference and this great opportunity. And thank you to my fellow panelists for contributing such fantastic papers and presentations. It was really interesting to listen to you both, and also to Professor Bose and Dr. Shil for serving as chair and discussing today, respectively. So I thought that I would start here today with a quote from Pandit Sundarlal, who was a Gandhian peace activist and led an unofficial goodwill mission from India to China for 6 weeks in 1951, the first such visit to China by Indians after the revolution. So here Sunderlal was addressing a reception held in honor of the delegation in Beijing to bid them farewell before their long journey back to Delhi. China has shown her strength. India has freed herself from the shackles of British imperialism. Other nations of Asia have either freed themselves or are just about to free themselves. Asia is bent upon being free and great once more. The unity of Asia is not meant for aggression against any other country. Surely we do not aim at invading any country in Europe or in America. Rather, our unity is a painful necessity. We have suffered for over a century from Western aggression, and some of us are still suffering. It is this common misfortune and danger that unites us. So the argument that I want to make today is that Sunderlal's description here of Asia reveals much about the later relationship that India and China had throughout the 1950s. So Sino-Indian friendship, as it was known, was defined centrally on the idea that both countries were Asian. But this Asianness was not necessarily just geographic, but rather reflected a specific temporality of having endured imperialism and attempting to move past its challenges. So instead of only promising a more utopian future, though, this Asia is also tinged, as Sunderlal suggests here, with potential crisis and fragility on account of the Cold War and the rise of bloc politics, which threatened to disrupt their progress to a post-colonial future. So the only way to make sure that Asia collectively overcame its challenges was to embrace a spirit of collaboration that respected differences, while also underscoring a shared challenge or shared struggle against imperialism's past, present, and potential. So that spirit of collaboration could be found in what Chinese and Indian activists and statesmen alike called friendship, a mixture of both state-to-state and people-to-people diplomatic efforts that aim to generate transnational solidarity against the threats of imperialism and war, while also tying the success of the solidarity to the success of nation building at home. Moreover, this friendship between China and India is promoted as a model that could be harnessed by the rest of the region, thus making it an essentially Asian project. So the political content of such a friendship was in many ways an extension of older models of anti-colonial resistance. So namely that political differences between different groups could be used productively and constructively in order to create a stronger, united front against a mutual enemy. So therefore, Indian conceptions of friendship with China invested in it a sort of cosmopolitanism that they saw as inherently distinct from bloc politics and hierarchical alliances that were being constructed by both superpowers at the time. So being Indian in this context thus meant also being Asian, and being Asian meant recognizing that the fight for freedom and peace required a new framework for international politics. So today I thought that I would try and provide a concise summary as possible of the paper. So I'll begin with these early understandings of Asia in both countries following the PRC's establishment and Chinese attempts to portray their revolution as a model for the region that followed. And then I'll move on to this Goodwill Mission in 1951 as a foundational moment for popularizing the idea of Indian friendship with China. And I'll conclude by tracing friendship as a concept as it was developed by these different friendship associations in both countries, particularly focusing on the various branches that emerged in India. By doing so, I aim to showcase the diffuse nature of Sino-Indian friendship and its associated understandings of Asia, its relationship to both state and non-state actors, and its localist, nationalist, and internationalist ambitions in the early Cold War. So it'd be first useful to define what people like Sunderlal actually meant when they referred to Asia or Asian unity. So of course, the idea of Pan-Asianism has already been explored by various intellectuals and politicians by the early 20th century. But I think in the scholarship, we've often assumed that this ideal of some sort of Asian unity was destroyed by the Japanese imperial project and taking advantage of that idea. I think it would be a mistake to think that Asia as a conceptual category completely fell out of favor after 1945, though. So mere months after the PRC was founded in 1949, Beijing hosted the young country's first conference in the form of the Conference of Asian Women, pictured here. And this was organized to address the ways that women in the region faced unique problems born out of their particular positionalities, both within their respective nations, but also within the international system itself. So as the conference's hosts argued in their opening statement, the goal of this conference was ultimately to unite the, quote, oppressed women of colonial and semi-colonial countries And they described the women of Asia as being united by having shared a history of, quote, living in slavery under the oppression of imperialism and feudal compradors. So the way that these conference goers defined Asia points to a shared sense of temporality, as I mentioned earlier. So both a past that was under colonialism, under the struggle against imperialism, and also present in trying to, quote, deal a powerful blow to the strength of imperialism and contribute to world peace. So activists and intellectuals across the region could use Asia as this way to conceptualize how their activities both at home and abroad were part of a single, wider transnational struggle. So in Asia, by this definition, it reflects a shared positionality in the international system. And so while originally the Chinese state was actually very hostile to Nehru's government, with Mao even writing to the Communist Party of India sometime in September 1949, hoping that they would overthrow this bourgeois and imperialist government, Indian recognition of the PRC early in 1950 actually helped to shift this. And the two countries drifted closer over the course of the rest of the year following the outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula and intensifying violence in Indochina. So these views were also not limited to Chinese organizations and conferences alone. Actually, these ideas about Asia were shared by a variety of Indian actors too. So the same Asia that the Conference of Asian Women invoked was likewise invoked by Indian intellectuals. So the popular quarterly United Asia regularly mentioned that India was interconnected with Asia and had a leadership over the region, had a responsibility to the region. So as the two countries grew closer over both states' shared international stances, especially once Nehru started to advocate for the PRC's inclusion in the UN, both states started to discuss the need to exchange delegations with each other, with the objective of mutual learning from a fellow Asian country with similarly Asian problems. So this came to a head in October of 1951. In order to celebrate the second anniversary of the PRC, delegates from around the world were invited to come tour the country. Responding to this invitation, Indian activists put together a delegation that represented, as they put it, various shades of opinion to provide as comprehensive a representation of Indian society as they could. So sanctioned by Nehru himself, this so-called unofficial delegation was composed of everyone from Gandhian pacifists to members of the Communist Party to standard center-right Congress liberals, and spent 6 weeks touring the PRC. And so though many of these members of the delegation had been very skeptical about international socialism, even the most conservative members of the mission admitted that there was something about the Chinese Revolution that was of clear importance to India. And why that was because the PRC was also an Asian country. So for example, Hannah Sen, who was the sole female member of the Goodwill Mission and leader of the centrist-leaning All India Women's Conference, despite her having previously expressed a lot of skepticism towards the Soviet Union and socialist politics more generally, she believed that China's shared struggles with India, despite its different political model, meant that the country was worth emulating to some extent. So writing for her audience a few months after her return, she declared that just like Indian women, their Chinese counterparts had equally been, quote, ground under by centuries of feudal tyranny. However, owing to land reform, which was going on at the time in China, and the recently announced marriage law, Chinese women had to Sen become a, quote, tremendous force for progress and enlightenment throughout the world. And so even though she didn't specifically endorse all aspects of the Chinese political program, Sen encouraged her readers to contemplate how similar reforms could be conducted in India. So for Sen, China's historical conditions as an Asian country meant that it lent itself well to comparisons with India's own status. And her writings to Indian audiences clearly invoked a desire to study the country in order to answer their own domestic political problems. So though she was specifically concerned with Indian women, Sen's belief in a solidarity between people in both countries based on their Asianness echoed much larger sentiments within India. So from 1951 onwards, a variety of local branches of the India-China Friendship Association, which I'll refer to as the ICFA, emerged throughout India, dedicating themselves to bettering relations between both countries on the basis that, quote, these two neighboring largest Asian countries, through their joint cooperation, can and must promote world peace, particularly peace in Asia, and take a decisive role in doing so. So a few months following the Goodwill Mission, a group of intellectuals, peace workers, and artists in Beijing likewise formed the China-India Friendship Association, and this was their conference, which I'll refer to as the Zhongyan Yoshe. So as the renowned historian and peace activist Guo Moreau, pictured here, declared at the organization's foundation, its purpose was to promote friendship and cultural exchange for the sake of Asia and the world. Thus, for both friendship associations in India and China, friendship between their countries was thus crucial at a moment when it seemed as though Asia was being overwhelmed by foreign threats and interventionism. So more than just that, though, the friendship that advocates of Sino-Indian relations referred to was also meant to be a model for the rest of Asia as a distinct alternative to the geopolitics of the day. To that end, the various branches of the ICFA declared that, like their Chinese equivalents, India also needed a fully national, all-India friendship movement. As the ICFA declared at its first national conference in December of 1952, which set up the ICFA's National Committee, which was headed by Pandit Sundarlal Hana Sen and several of the other original Goodwill Missions delegates, Sino-Indian friendship could forge a, quote, common destiny for the whole of Asia, and through Asia, the destiny of the whole world, by eschewing the tendency of one man or one group attempting to impose his will or its will on others for an environment of harmony and mutual goodwill. So the nation-building project in both countries is seen as key to this, allowing them to grow strong enough to prevent war and imperialism from reoccurring in the region. As Kaka Kalilkar, a famed Gandhian activist and founding member of the ICFA, argued at this conference, the hydrogen bomb had added a sense of urgency for creating better relations between both countries. Continuing, he proclaimed, "We both came under the domination of Western powers. Our sympathy must naturally go to each other for all the humiliation we suffered under the tutelage of the West. But now the sun has risen again in the East, and Asia is pulsating with a new life and new aspirations." So for Kalilkar and indeed the rest of the National Committee, friendship was this project that was in stark contrast to the so-called tutelage of the West. It was about mutual learning. It was about learning from each other, exchanging a more sort of horizontal set of relationships. And this necessitated a broad, united front of political actors to help provide an exemplar for this type of cosmopolitanism that Asia needed to resist the logic of Cold War era geopolitics. So the National Committee thus brought together politicians from the Congress Party, oppositional figures from the Communists and the Praja Socialists, as well as an eclectic group of journalists, intellectuals, industrialists, and Gandhians. So this internal diversity that they cultivated within the organization was meant to likewise reflect the respect for diversity inherent to friendly relations between India and China, where despite pursuing different economic and political models, they were still banding together in solidarity. And actually this helped to ensure that the ICFA grew tremendously. So the National Conference, which was coupled with a delegation from the Zhongyan Yoshe, captured the attention of India's national media and led to the establishment of local branches throughout the country. So these sentiments were thus not the feelings of just a few activists limited to only speeches and rhetoric. It had a much wider sort of resonance, and it had a resonance up to the upper echelons of the state as well. So just a few months after the conference concluded, Joe and Nehru, so that's Joe and Lai and Prime Minister Nehru, met and famously promulgated the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence as the basis of how both countries would pursue their foreign relations. And so that was mutual non-interference, mutual respect, mutual non-aggression, equality, and peaceful coexistence. So as Joe and Lai and Nehru declared in their joint declaration, these 5 principles would help to, quote, set an example for Asian countries and tell them how Asia's problems can and must be resolved, with Nehru later contrasting this directly with the military alliances and bloc politics which threatened to, as he put it, extend the area of the Cold War to all of Asia. So by promising friendly relations despite their commitment to different political ideologies and economic regimes, Nehru and Joe suggested that the 5 principles held the key to regional and world peace. So under this rubric, Asia's history under colonialism actually empowered it with the desire and the urge to create a new world. So following this historic moment, the ICFA's various local branches began to draw in ever larger numbers of members and observers, integrating themselves into wider social movements and agitations for peace. So the Indian state largely welcomed this as a way to increase its own prestige, both internally and abroad. And it patronized the ICFA as the unofficial counterpart to its own diplomatic efforts. So there's certainly some evidence that this actually worked, with India's so-called leadership over Asia with China being largely accepted and celebrated by diffuse elements of Indian society. So the ICFA, one thing that I should note is that it really wasn't a unitary organization. Actually, it got its power from the fact that it was essentially a network of different branches that all pursued their own strategies for engaging with Sino-Indian friendship. So as the decade went on, delegations such as these pictured between the two countries became more and more common, and authors speculate that more than several thousand Indian and Chinese citizens each visited each other's countries throughout the 1950s. So many of these delegations were supported, if not outright organized, by both the Zhongyun Yoxie and the ICFA's leadership. So both organizations ultimately aimed to include as many branches and localities as they possibly could in order to spread more awareness about both countries' relationships amongst the general population, in line with their commitment to cultural exchange and mutual learning. However, if the ICFA's National Committee aimed to be this vanguard in promoting knowledge of China and both countries' centrality to a better and brighter Asia, it soon found itself unable to do so on its own. The organization's central office was usually starved for funds, and individual branches of the ICFA essentially took things into their own hands. So for members in Allahabad, this meant encouraging authors to write stories about China in Hindi in order to reach a larger audience and promote a quote, struggle against imperialism in order to help save Asian peace, ensure Asian liberation, and greatly contribute to world peace. In Nagpur, it meant using the city's historic connections to the Gandhian movement to encourage their Chinese guests to rethink the violence of the Chinese Revolution at home. Similarly, the leadership of the Mysore branch translated Chinese films, periodicals, and books into Kannada, and tied their branch's history to several local politicians who had stood opposed to, quote, war, colonialism, backwardness, and poverty. And so they sidestepped the central office entirely by directly contacting the leader of a visiting Chinese delegation in 1956, expressing to him that their exhibitions and pamphlets had helped to make our own humble contribution towards the task of consolidating and strengthening India-China friendship, and had generated great interest throughout Mysore state in the achievements of the Chinese people and the manner in which they are tackling their own problems, many of which are greatly similar to ours. So coupled by their oath to abide by the 5 principles as this model for peaceful coexistence and their state's recent economic progress, they argued that Mysore was an ideal destination for future visits from Chinese delegates, precisely because of their local particularities. So these local branches highlighted their individual commitment to Sino-Indian friendship and privileged their own cultural and political heritage as distinct and important parts of the Indian nation that the Zhongyun Yoxie had come to learn about. So localities could thus carve out their own role within these national and transnational narratives, taking the 5 principles and notions of Sino-Indian friendship and making them into actionable ideals that their members could participate in. And the Zhongyun Yoxie's various delegations from China corroborated this. The organization's leaders commented frequently on the diversity and the warmth that they encountered throughout their country. So as one such delegate, a woman named by the name of Xie Bingxin, detailed in her memoirs, in every place we visited, we were received by the central government, local governments, educational, artistic, religious, industrial, commercial, peasant, and women's organizations. Waves of people surrounded us, shaking our hands, embracing us, presenting us with garlands, gifting us with flowers, as slogans thundered in the air.
Yes, I have 1 minute left, sorry.
Okay, I'll wrap up. So as I've discussed, the advocates of Sino-Indian friendship developed these ideas of Asia and friendship that were reflective of both the anxieties about geopolitical trends in the early Cold War, as well as the hopes of what a post-colonial world order could look like, and the role that both countries could play in making this. So these narratives about Asia helped to animate a variety of different actors, from local politicians to Gandhians, who in turn acted to support Sino-Indian friendship in their own ways. Despite this diversity, though, at the heart of these slogans, delegations, and conferences was a mode of solidarity that eschewed political differences for embracing a united front against imperialism, war, and bloc politics. So the movement for friendship could thus cross political boundaries as well as divisions between state and non-state actors, all the while relying on the power of local activities to fuel transnational solidarity for the sake of a better Asia and a better world, thereby breaking with both the colonial past and the Cold War present for a post-colonial future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasser. I certainly am persuaded by your claim that Asia as a conceptual category was alive and well in the post-Second World War decade or decade and a half. We'll talk more during the discussion period if there is time. But it would be interesting to see how you relate the concept of friendship to the rhetoric of brotherhood in the same period. But of course, what's beyond the scope of this paper that you've presented is how friendship dissolved into enmity by the late 1950s and the early 1960s. But for now, we need to move on to the fourth and final paper of this panel. Arunima Addy is a PhD candidate in art history at Penn State. She has been a architect in India, and for her PhD dissertation, she is looking at the relationship between the politics of religion and nation building as it relates to Indian temple architecture. The title of her paper is Modernity Under an Ancient Cloak, Architecture and Hindu Nationalism in Banaras. Arunima.
Arunima, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
No, we still can't hear you.
Arunima, would you log out and log in again?
No, we can't still.
Maybe try an earphone if your speakers are not picking up your voice. Maybe try an earphone, a mobile earphone or something. Arunima, on the right-hand corner, sorry, Parth, is it okay if I just come in and advise?
Yes, of course, yeah, please.
Arunima, on the right-hand corner, there's a wheel, a chakra-like thing. That's the settings. Look at that. Click on that and see that the right speaker or audio for your device is selected. Go on the top right-hand corner. There's a wheel kind of a thing besides the chat symbol. Click on that and see that the right audio speaker or microphone or whatever it's the thing that you use for your chat, that's selected. It's not something else that's selected. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great.
So I want to start by thanking Professor Sugata Bose for your kind presence and Rohit for this for organizing this wonderful workshop. And today I'll be presenting my ongoing work on architecture and Hindu nationalism in Banaras, and I'm looking forward to your valuable feedbacks. So I'll share my screen now.
There's an option beside camera screen. Button.
Can you see? Can you all see?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So, Banaras is widely known as an eternal sacred Hindu holy place. However, there are counter-narratives to the predominant Hindu image of the city. The city, arguably the religious heart of India, always had anything but a monolithic identity. It has displayed diverse images from the Vedic times through the Mughal period to the post-colonial and post-colonial days. The palimpsest of contested religious identities and their political connotations make the historical complexities of Banaras a compelling resource for understanding evolving Hindu nationalism in India through different epochs. The many competing real but unmet, subtly ingrained cultural memories of the city, which are now a part of life, need attention to remember the past, if not retrieve. These tensions complicate the place identity of Banaras, stretched between paradoxical reality, modern violent communal tension, and peaceful religious associations. This research, taking cues from the built environment, investigates how architecture acts as a political tool in the construction of national identity based on a religious foundation. It investigates this through the study of changing architectural styles in the built environment of Banaras from the early 20th century to the present. The study looks at three case studies that are significant to the changing religious landscape of Banaras. And a comparative analysis of these case studies discusses the hybridization of architecture while holding on to ideas of an authentic Hindu nationalist identity. This research, using Banaras with all its antiquity, conflicting historical narratives, religions, traditions, and a cosmopolitan identity, as an illustrative example, brings forth an unresolved issue, which is the perpetual conflict between modernity and authenticity, and by extension, its aftermaths on the evolving Hindu identity of secular India. With its long history since the Vedic period, the ancient city of Banaras has developed as a foundational place for Hindu pilgrimage in India. But originally, through other scholarships, it has been identified that despite its Hindu identity, there is evidence of an Islamic past entangled in layers of the city. The suppressed Islamic culture has always been compromised at the altar of the Hindu sacred space. During colonial rule, the British tried to disdain the city's Islamic past and contributed towards its obliteration. They had taken refuge in framing the nation with one uncontested religion, Hinduism. However, the emphasis on Hinduism as an ancient, glorious national past was not used as a political tool in the Indian nationalist movement until the last decade of the 19th century. The Hindu nationalists, drawing from both the Hindu temple architecture and colonial Indo-Saracenic style, attempted to create their vision of an authentic Hindu temple. It would reflect their indigenous identity, connecting to its glorious Hindu past while endorsing Western modernity. Other than being religious, Hinduism manifested as a cultural and political tool in nation building. It constructed a new religious identity that was imprinted in the spatial politics through new installations in the built environment. I have selected these three case studies that are significant to the changing religious landscape in Banaras. First, I will talk about the Banaras Hindu University, or BHU, an institution built on the premise of hybrid architecture. Followed by that, I'll talk about Bharat Mata Temple, which reflects a mixed purpose of both temple and a museum. Lastly, I will discuss the transformation of the coveted ancient Vishwanath Temple into a global spectacle. The Banaras Hindu University was established in 1916 by a Brahmin scholar and nationalist leader, Malavya, to promote Hindu learning along with Western discipline. Malavya intended to bring a change in the look of universities from the ones built by the British. BHU expresses a smooth blend of Hindu temple architecture with the ongoing British Indo-Saracenic style, wanting to be at par with the earlier powerful Mughal hegemony. The British started incorporating Islamic architectural elements like domes, arches, while imparting a monumental scale to the buildings in order to resonate with an existing socio-cultural expectation within India. While incorporating neo-Gothic elements such as pointed arches, spires, and pinnacles, British architects also started including domed pavilions or chhatris and minarets to embed institutional architecture within a local context. While this Indo-Saracenic style had a blend of Western and Indian architectural styles, which included domes, walls, and minarets, the Hindu derivative of Indo-Saracenic, as seen in BHU, consciously omitted the Islamic elements. The architects designed the buildings and colleges as replicas of temple towers or shikhara, but as the nation was transitioning towards an invented modern Hindu identity, the architectural style demanded a renovation. Departing from the traditional temple tower style, the local architect of the institution, Jwala Prasad, inaugurated a new style of shikhara that would herald the modern yet traditional architectural style. The towers inculcated the addition of new motifs like the one resembling a Hindu temple as we see in the Sanskrit Mahavidyalaya at BHU. The institution buildings adorned decorative brackets, columns, and eaves built on the classical trabeated Hindu temple structure, shifting from the typical arcuate Indo-Saracenic or Islamic architectural systems. Among other Hindu elements of temple architecture inculcated are the building facades, latticed railings on the terrace, which are typical of Hindu temples, corbelled doorways, windows, and external arches, suggestive of a typical Hindu temple. All the institutions, hostels, and administrative buildings are painted in the symbolic color of Hinduism, saffron, in contrast to the whitewashed civic infrastructures built by the British during that period. Having said that, though a serious attempt had been made to make BHU look specifically Hindu, there are architectural features similar to the Indo-Saracenic style blended with these elements. The building facades prominently feature small elevated dome-shaped pavilions or the chhatris, which is a very typical feature in the Indo-Islamic style. Some hostels have enormous doorways made of leafed Mughal arches, such as the one seen in Birla Hostel. Another building on the campus that shows the obvious influence of the West, or rather, an integration of the East and the West, is the Central Library of BHU. The central reading room of the library, with an enormous dome on the top, is a replica of the existing British Museum reading room in London. It influences the large European dome with a shikhara or the temple tower on top of it and chhatris on the four corners of the roof to add a flavor of indigenousness. We can say that they constructed the institution on the veins of Western educational infrastructure with an external cover of Indian temple architecture. Being situated in the renowned sacred landscape of Banaras, and most importantly within the modified Panchkroshi Yatra, an ancient pilgrimage path connecting the significant temples in Banaras, the university by default got an air of Hindu sanctity. The radial planning of the campus has intersecting roads in concentric circles diverging from the center point, the amphitheater. Malviya hired a Western architect and planner, Frank Lishman, to conceptualize the campus planning. Being a Western-educated Hindu Brahmin, Malviya demanded both the indigenous and Western planning strategies be incorporated. It must be noted around the mid-19th century, there was a surge in campus planning in both Europe and America. The BHU planning shows a strong influence of the City Beautiful movement that was going on in the West. The radial planning, with enormous open green spaces in between the edifices, stand out as a characteristic Western planning ideology in contrast to the rest of the congested, unplanned old city of Banaras. Though the invention of this architectural style and planning strategy was Hindu revivalism, much of the aspects of the style are cloaking under the realms of Western modernity. However, what can be appreciated with certainty is that this invented architectural style of this period spoke on behalf of the nation, a nation seeking self-identity and turning to establish new inspirational resources through the built environment. Coming to my second case study, the Bharat Mata Temple in Banaras. Babu Shiv Prasad Gupta, a Western-educated member of Hindu reformist movements, was astounded by a display of the colonial printed maps on his visit to the British Museum in London. On his return to Banaras in 1918, he hired Durga Prasad, a sculptor, to design a scaled relief map of India using colonial cartographic knowledge. Constructed in the Hindu heartland and yet not enshrining any familiar deity from the Hindu pantheons of gods and goddesses, the temple enshrines a map of India as the deity. The Bharat Mata temple does not look like typical temples of that region or that period. The temple architecture steps back from the ongoing culture of having typical elements like temple towers and domed pavilions. Though the temple itself does not adorn Hindu motifs on its columns or facades, the entrance door shows a mix of secular as well as Hindu symbology. We find these archaic Jain serpentine brackets, which were also adapted in Akbar's Fatehpur Sikri, being reused in this temple. There is a decorative keystone with Om written on it, followed by Vande Mataram or Hail Motherland. The inscription of the Gayatri Mantra, a universal prayer enshrined in the Vedas, followed by symbols of the sun and moon on the two sides of the entrance door, though distinctively Hindu, also resonates a message of universality. The centrally located relief map of India intends to ignite Hindu nationalism in the hearts of the visitors. The metaphorical expression of Bharat Mata in the form of the relief map expresses the imagination of nation before there was a nation. The map showed a physically united India. Before this time, India was not imagined as one nation. In fact, the map also shows Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka to be a part of the Indian map, though they were never part of the colonial India. The extended landscape fueled patriotic feeling among the nationalist leaders to draw a larger vision of free India. The map goddess tried to arrest a moment of change in the country by igniting patriotic feelings among citizens. The Bharat Mata temple, with the deity of relief map of India, depicts a fusion of a holy place and as a museum artifact. It acts as a sacred historical monument that traces the ancient glorious past, preaches Hindu devotionalism, ignites patriotism, as well as educates the public about an idea of a secular nation. Hinduism has been intelligently expressed in the folds of this invented architecture that fluctuates its essence between secular modernism and religious nationalism. More importantly, it must be noted that during this period, Hinduism was going through an intellectual reformist movement, and the founder was a prominent member of such groups. Organizations like Arya Samaj and Brahmo Samaj declined Hindu idol worship and drifted towards believing in one God, like Christianity in the West. Hinduism was more a way of life than religion for these people. Considering the political context, the Bharat Mata temple sometimes reflects the idea of modern secular India. At other times, it shows an overturn of the nation being Hindu. Coming to my third and the last case study, the Kashi Vishwanath Corridor Project. The Vishwanath Temple complex, a historically politically charged site, is once again in the limelight as the current right-wing government has proposed a large-scale redevelopment plan of the city's most significant temple precinct. The government's vision of making ancient Banaras a global spectacle is not only intervention in the urban setting and historical landscape of the city, but also a complete alteration of its place identity to establish the city's Hindu nature. A 65 feet wide pilgrim corridor has been proposed for the Kashi Vishwanath temple complex that aims to decongest the crowd around the temple area. It connects the temple to the riverfront, to be specific, the most renowned Manikarnika Ghat. The proposed development plan has provision for amenities for pilgrims like guest houses, library, museum, and souvenir stores. But sadly, this intervention is replacing the traditional riverbank landscape with a modern contemporary vision. While the project is opening doors of the ancient city as an iconic Hindu pilgrimage destination to a global audience, it is also suppressing the unique local identity of the place that had blurred boundaries between Hindus and Muslims of this region. The optimistic vision of the government's revitalization proposal kind of negates the substantial loss of sacred landscape, cultural memory, and sense of place, and by extension, national identity. There has been a mass-scale demolition in the contested historic fabric of the precinct. The Gangeshwar temple was one of the 50 or more temples that had emerged from the centuries-old havelis or mansions during demolition. Ancient as the name sounds, the deity is now being worshipped daily. The revival of this temple exemplifies the invention of tradition, marking the beginning of the rewriting of a historic narrative, a new story with an ancient reference. Unfortunately, all could not be preserved during demolition and are lost forever. Another valuable place gone astray is the lively, narrow, labyrinthine alley connecting the temple, also known as the Vishwanath Gully. When interviewing the shopkeepers of this region, I learned that they have been running their family business in that alley through 3 to 4 generations and have been residing in mansions or the havelis in that alley, which date back to the Mughal period. In lieu of some good money, they were relocated far away from the religious center of the city. With this, not only the old mansions were torn down, but also many people lost their livelihood. After the demolition, the famous street remains a memory, a nostalgia of the lively, charming, archaic place it used to be. This
Arunima, you have 1 minute
project, yeah,
Arunima.
thank you. This redevelopment plan ignites little resemblance with the past, given that it is designed through a hybrid exaggeration of temple architectural style that does not reflect any regional sense of place. The Kashi Corridor project, built on precedents of monumentality and modern infrastructural religious commodities such as the Akshardham Temple, a theme park-based recreational hub, is competing for an audience in the global market. By making it contemporary and extravagant, the Indian government is trying to incorporate Vishwanath Temple in the global iconography of urban spectacles. The nation's secular identity is also being camouflaged under a constructed notion of Hinduism. This is in conjunction with the nation opening its doors to global opportunities in the neoliberal market. The reconstructed aesthetics display fragmentation and selective erasure of historic visual and material records seen in the spectacular Kashi Corridor project is an outcome of underlying currents of politics of national identity formation and global capitalism. Amidst many contested and conflicting forms and practices, the sacred landscape of Banaras continues its existence with yet another rewriting of history. In conclusion, be it the Euro-American planning of BHU or the art of cartography brought home from the West in Bharat Mata Temple, or the revamped Kashi corridor opening its doors to the global audience. This research shows that there has been a perpetual practice of using architecture as a political tool in the construction of Hindu identity in a secular India. Such conflicts around the built environment reveal that it is essentially the physical control over prominent religious centers that crucially embodies the essence of religious nationalism. In this case, Hindu nationalism. Such political outcomes also suggest that there is a flaw in the secular nature of India. If secularism must exist as a living reality for India, it must come to terms with the rising and dominating sentiment of Hinduism. In the end, however, Banaras, in its resilience, trumps through various guises of modernity in the shadow of its ancient past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arunima. And of course, it's sad to see the pictures of Banaras that you showed towards the end. It's the same architect, of course, Bimal Patel, who is in charge of the Central Vista project in Delhi. There are, I'm sure, aspects of your paper that deserve to be discussed. We are going to manage the 20 minutes that are left to us. I think I'll ask Partha to be as self-disciplined as he possibly can be in order to make his discussant's comments, and leaving a little bit of time for at least a couple of questions from the audience, and then for the chair to say a few words in conclusion. And also, I'm sure that the speakers would want to respond to at least some of the comments being made. So let's try to make the best of the 20 minutes that are left to us.
Yes, absolutely. I have very few comments to make because, I mean, the papers were very different and eclectic. So, I mean, I was kind of struggling to organize my thoughts about them. And I don't work on any of these areas. So you please forgive me if I am most of my comments are in the form of reactions and curiosities. So let me begin with Yasser's paper, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Even as I know little about this area, I think it is a testament to the clarity and crispness of Yasser's writing. That is, I was able to really get on board with him in this journey. It was the longest paper submitted in the panel, but it was truly pleasurable to read. So I learned a lot.
Sorry about that.
No, it was great. However, as an outsider to this field, I want to ask some broad questions. Firstly, I felt that the spectrum of levels of politics and actors in the political field was a bit too varied. While it makes for a wonderful historical narrative for the reader, analytically speaking, one keeps wondering how to tease out some of the generalizations. By making the story of a national friendship an object of study, you've placed before us both state actors as well as civil society actors, but often the lines of narrative seamlessly move between these two levels of actors. Your point about the assertion of the local, especially the Kannadigas in the ICFA, is an excellent point, I thought. But that was just one way of inflecting a national ideological formation with a local assertion. The actual stories of localities, the politics among various social classes involved in these organizations, why certain figures participate in the Sino-Indian friendship to bolster the ideology of Asian unity, I felt requires a more thorough dive into the locality itself. Again, at the national level, the strategic machinations that go behind an administration promoting certain ideological currents in civil society require more delving into the murkier parts of state-building exercises. At some points, in fact, I could sense a certain nostalgia about Nehruvian India that might be painting an overly utopian picture of the times. But most significantly, the entire chapter has primarily a focus on the ideological formation that all of these organizations and state actors produced. And this focus on the ideological moment might be creating a utopian picture of various actors seeking out Asian utopias. Even a rigorous study of utopian visions needs a thorough digging out of the political economy that embeds those visions. So my broad comment or suggestion is that you might want to temper this story by bringing in some more conventional political analysis that includes strategy at the national governmental level and political economy at the level of analyzing non-state actors. But overall, I really loved your paper, and I hope to hear and read more parts of it eventually. The next paper that comes closest to the theme of because the theme of post-colonial, early post-colonial period was quite prominent in at least two papers. There is the second one that comes close to Saawani's paper on the legacies of civil-military relations in India and the First Kashmir War. Again, I know very few things about this field, so please forgive me if my comments are of limited value. Your discussion of the resource challenges that the military faced during the transfer of power was quite interesting, but you also had an interesting and consistent line of argument about the nationalist elite's mistrust of the military. It appeared as though there might have been a diffidence among the nationalist elite in dealing with the military. Now, one of the things that we know from existing research is that by 1937, when the Congress Party had formed governments and ministries in the provinces under the Government of India 1935 Act, the Congress leaders had taken quite enthusiastically to using the coercive apparatuses of state power, such as the police, in governing. And by 1946, again, they had started forming provincial ministries. And as you point out clearly in your paper, the Congress was no supporter of the RIN mutiny. So in the light of this, it was a bit curious what you really signified by the nationalist ambivalence about the military. In fact, the partition-related violence had very much led to nationalist elite relying emphatically on colonial instruments of order, such as the military and the police. So if you could elaborate a bit on this point to clarify what your argument is, that might be useful. Next is Arunima's paper. It was quite interesting as it came from an architectural and art historical point of view. And I think it was a good idea to bring those three sites into an analytical frame. I think a larger point is well taken. That is the point about the erasure of the local historical texture involved in the construction of Hindu nationalist identity, which is at the same time also modern. But yeah, at the end of your paper, you seem to raise, in a sort of a throwaway line, a critical question on the nature of secularism in India. And I was wondering if you could expand on that so that we can understand your framework a little better, because you used words like modern, traditional, secular, religious, Hindu, and sometimes I was not very certain about the specific meanings you were associating with them. But the only other point that I had was that if you were interested in locating it in the wider historiography of urban studies or urban history of South Asia, because in some ways it's the city that is tying them together. And in the study of cities, there has been a long discussion of built environments, embedding, power relations in them. So if this can be brought into conversation with urban history generally. Avarna's paper on corruption was extensive in its temporal reach. But to be frank, I struggled a bit in locating your work in the wider literature on corruption and the state in South Asia. So my only request to you would be if you would please say a few lines to tell us what is the main point of departure that your work is trying to make in this particular field of corruption, studies of corruption? What are one or two central new findings and that will change our understanding of this phenomenon that we've not had? I mean, there were a few interesting entry points. For instance, you spoke about Adam Smith, and there was liberalism and individualism sort of emerging as a little idea there, but you didn't develop it further. There was the notion of the public, which Professor Bose also raised, which you might want to think about. What does the public really mean in the colonial context? But generally, if you could tell us about what is the contribution you're trying to make? Thank you so much. I hope you don't need to respond to all of them if you don't want to.
Thank you, Parth. I think that given that we have 12 minutes left, I'll make a few brief comments on each of the 4 papers, and then perhaps take at least a couple of questions from the audience. And I'd be grateful to you, Parth, if you can manage that, and then give speakers, brief responses to whichever of the comments they want to take up. Avarna, there's always a bit of a challenge when you take up a very long period to study. And so if you are really wanting to investigate post-colonial sort of best to begin with the Prevention of Corruption Act of 1947 and then see, what it is in the colonial definitions of corruption that this particular piece of legislation draws on. Because, it may not actually, go back to the company period. It may have something more to do with late 19th century definitions of corruption under the Crown and so forth. I'm fascinated by both the papers by Saawani and Yasser, and in fact, I've written quite a bit of late on the broad subject which Yasser deals with. And in fact, I opened my chapter on that period with a visit of a cultural delegation. The Bengali singer, Debabrata Bishwas, wrote a wonderful Bengali memoir of his visits to China in the 1950s. But let me just say a word about how I see the two papers sort of intersecting. One of the challenges to this aspiration for Asian solidarity in the late 40s, not so much in the early 50s, was the colonial legacy of Indian troops being sent abroad to fight in defense of British imperial interests. So even at the Asian Relations Conference of March-April 1947, held just before independence and partition, there was a good bit of disquiet on the part of the Indonesians and the Vietnamese about the use of Indian troops. Nehru had to intervene, saying that Indian troops had been withdrawn from Indonesia by November 1946. He also had to express sympathy with the Vietnamese freedom struggle, but he asked, how can we declare war on France? And the Vietnamese either graciously or grudgingly acknowledged that, even though Gurkha troops were sent to fight against us, we recognize that the present Indian government is not really against our struggle for independence from the French. And so there was, always this legacy of, and we all know about the use of Indian soldiers in China in the early part of the 20th century, which left something of a bitter trail even in the future. But clearly, there was something going on in the late 40s and the early 50s, that the process of post-colonial state formation, hardened borders between Asian countries, and yet, there were particularly civil society initiatives which were of great importance in seeking to somehow, bolster a sense of Asian solidarity, if not unity. And I think both projects are very important, and there are points of intersection between them. Finally, on Arunima's paper, I'd be very interested to know what was going on in Banaras in the late 40s and the early 50s. We know the developments in Somnath and Ayodhya in that period. And so what was the early post-colonial state doing with the legacy of this temple city of Banaras? We understand that there is a much more dramatic transformation that is being attempted by the Modi regime now. But to get a sense of, the transition from colonial rule to the post-colonial era, it would be interesting to figure out what was happening in the first decade after independence and partition in Banaras. Let me stop there. And if I may, Parth, can you ask for 2 questions from the audience?
Yes.
And then
I've actually
give it to the speakers.
On the chat, but I think Rohit wants to say something.
So Professor Bose, is it okay if, unless you have a class or a supervision now, should we extend it by 15 minutes so that at least we get a substantial time for the Q&A?
Yes. Yeah, I'm not in a hurry to leave. So yes, okay. In fairness to the 4 excellent papers given, we should extend the time, I think. And I see that there are questions from the audience. Let's take them and then give a right of response.
I think
there's Nipon wanting to ask 2 questions to Arunima.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Okay. Thanks to the organizer, Professor Bose, Dr. Shil, and all the panelists. I have 2 questions for Arunima. One is that, the kind of experiment with architecture you are talking about that is happening in BHU in the 1920s. A similar kind of experiment also happened in Kolkata with the making of the Boshu Vigyan Mandir or the Bose Institute, the Research Institute of Jagadish Chandra Bose, because he was actually employing Nandalal Bose and was trying to bring together the Mughal architecture, the Buddhist architecture, and the Islam, and also the Rajasthan temple architecture, and trying to make a kind of institute. And also, he's calling it a mundir, right? So the whole connection with the temple, and something that Kolkata being a city where neoclassical style was the dominant style during the colonial period, and also a bit of neo-Gothic revival in case of the Calcutta High Court. So he was trying to make a institution where the architecture will be also be speaking about the kind of the Indian perspective to science that he was trying to add. So the Indian perspective to science that Ashish Nandi will be calling his kind of scientific practices. And also this experiment will actually get a bigger version in the making of Shanti Niketan, where the same sort of people like Nandalal Bose, Avarindanath, they were, and the kind of the Bharat Mata temple is actually very similar to the Udayan building of Shanti Niketan. So my question is that how the experiment that was happening in BHU, is there kind of a dialogue between the similar kind of experiments happening outside BH in the similar context of making of academic institutions? And the second question is more specific, that is, if we are talking about BHU, a Hindu nationalist project, Madan Mohan Malviya's role in the making of Hindu nationalism in India, and we also know that how from the 1920s and 30s, Savarkar, they will be talking about who is a Hindu, right? So the Muslims, they are not a true Hindu or true Indian. Now, if in a Hindu nationalist project like BHU, you are actually taking in Mughal architectural style, then what is a Hindu? And what happens to the category of Hindu? That is my question, because there is difference between the idea of Hindu that is being propagated by the Hindu nationalists, and if we call this a Hindu temple or a Hindu architecture which includes Mughal buildings, then what does the word Hindu mean here? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nipon. In the interests of time, I'll ask the speakers to remember the questions and comments, and we'll ask. For now, Rohit says he has a question for Avarna.
Yeah, so more than a question, this is also something which I think when I first saw your abstract, I was thinking that it was very interesting to have an intellectual history of corruption per se, with its point of divergence from the existing literature. And I think both Professor Bose and Parth have actually highlighted on. My point is, how do you actually link it up with the pre-colonial traditions? Let's think of what Harbans Mukhia and others have said, the Mughal culture of gift-giving. And with Nick Dirks, suggests that there is the Central Asian tradition of gift-giving, which, if again, I'm going back to what Tavernier's writings and all, which suggest that the Britishers and most of the colonizing, formations were pretty happy with that. I know gift-giving or bribery could be a very micro part of your broader rubric of corruption, but most of the colonizing forces were pretty happy to sort of, copy that pre-existing tradition of gift-giving, bribery, peshki, and all of that. Is much later, and I think that is where it would be great if you could develop it. That if whether liberalism or individualism is the point of divergence, what sort of causes this divergence, where they suddenly think that a new rupture needs to come about, there needs to be a shift from the tradition, while they were quite happy pursuing the previous tradition of gift giving, bribery to get their job done. So yeah, that's one comment. Thank you.
Is there a question for either Yasser or Saawani from the audience? Not seeing any at the moment. I think I will I will ask the speakers to respond in the order in which they spoke. So, Avarna, would you like to start with
Yeah,
Rohit's
sure.
question and perhaps Partha's comment? Yeah.
Absolutely. And honestly, thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. Rohit, I think that this is something which I have also wondered about as to why is it that, once upon a time you had the practice of gift giving and suddenly it becomes a very questionable or a sort of like an immoral activity, especially as I mentioned in the Regulating Act, this underlying idea that you cannot accept presents from natives. I think, to be honest, there's, like I mentioned, a lot of anxiety regarding mismanagement. And there's, of course, this whole context of the clash between what's perceived as Anglo and what's perceived as customary law. So, as the EIC is moving forward and it's becoming a governing institution, I mean, we have to remember the fact it was a trading company beforehand. It became a governing institution after some time. Um, and there's, of course, a lot of question coming from the metropole, from London, especially in the British Parliament, that are we sure that EIC is equipped to actually govern this entire subcontinent? It's actually gaining control over so much revenue, and are they actually having the ability to do that? Of course, we have to recognize the fact that there's this power play happening. There's this very constant desire from the crown to take over the control of subcontinent, and that in that particular context is where the whole idea of corruption sort of comes out as a political tool, where the idea is to, in a way, control power, to legitimize power. EIC on one hand is trying to say that no, it's not us, it's the natives who is actually the problem. Whereas the crown is like, we don't really agree with this. We think you're trying to take advantage of us, of the English and the natives as well. That's really the very, very complex drama that's actually going on. I know that your idea is a bit more nuanced, and I'm trying to simplify the answer, but that's really the, in a way, I would say, the guiding light that kind of makes the rupture really happen. And in a way, it's, of course, still very, very evident. And I know there's also a rush. So answering back to you, Partha, I think when I shared the paper with you, I was definitely still in an initial stage of working on it. So thank you for bearing with me. I think the few key points which I think it'll be too soon for me to say arguments. I think it's more of a curiosity which I have. Definitely one is I'm very curious about why are there certain categories or certain social groups that are in a way seen as the site to lay blame. Like whether in every different time you have different groups that are emerging, right? Whether it's the native subordinates, whether it's the industrial class in 20th century. It's very curious to me as to why the state chooses to blame certain particular groups. Um, of course, I mean we do understand the corruption is there is actually no concern whatsoever with the actual act of corruption. It's just a tool to use, and it's strange for me that's still continuing right now, despite there being such extensive interest in that. There's actually no change in the way people are addressing it. And in that light, what I also find very interesting is the whole notion of bribery, especially since there's such concern about revenue accumulation. That becomes such an important thing for the modern state, of course, from colonial to post-colonial time. And that's really where I'm trying to locate it. So I think, as I had said, there is no very strong argument. It's more of a curiosity which I have right now, which hopefully I'll develop and then get back to you on it. So yeah, thank you for your comments. And if anybody else has anything, I would be happy to answer it.
Thank you, Avarna. Let's go to Saawani.
Hello. So first, I'll try to reflect a bit on Professor Bose's question, like what was happening during 1950s Indian architecture. So post-independence, there was Nehru's vision of making India a very like putting India on an international platform, and for that he had got Le Corbusier, an internationally renowned architect, to design Chandigarh as the capital complex of New India. And so that style was international as well as modern and contemporary. And following that, I think in 1980s, Kenneth Frampton came up with his concept of critical regionalism, and architects like Charles Correa started building places like Jawahar Kala Kendra, which is built on the veins of uh, Indian ideologies, but on a very but with a very visually modern style. And followed by that, there was Raj-Byrne in Delhi and B.V. Doshi in Ahmedabad, who were kind of creating the local architecture in a more global context. Now, answering to Shandipan Mitra's question, they were really wonderful questions. Thank you. And regarding the Mughal architecture in Hindu temples, firstly, when I'm talking about Banaras Hindu University and the Mughal architecture ingrained in it, by that I was actually talking about the Indo-Saracenic style, which was adopted by the British. It was a hybrid of Islamic style and Neo-Gothic style. And so being a hybrid of these two styles, the Indo-Saracenic had domes and minarets and chhatris and other Mughal features. So when Malviya wanted to adopt, like hybridize this modern, the Western style of Indo-Saracenic, he was also trying to adapt to the Mughal arches and things like that in his building, which also shows a sense of monumentality and also was going with the current style that was prevalent during that colonial period, and hence the merge of East, West, as well as the Islamic styles in BHU. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Arunima. Let's go to Saawani now. Saawani?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Professor Bose, for your comments, Partha and Rohit for organizing all of this and all your help through the process of getting my paper to you. So I'll just go to Partha's question about the Indian nationalist elites and their sort of alienation. I think a better way to describe it would be their discomfort, because essentially I think they are okay with the use of the military. They're okay with the modernization of the military. They're okay with the use of the military. And when I say nationalist elites, and because it was a very much broad brush approach for this paper, their approaches to say the Second World War were not uniform. So you had Nehru and the Congress on one side, then you had Ambedkar, for example, who obviously agreed that the nationalist elite should have been co-opted and consulted, but also saw this as an opportunity for social mobility, being part of the army and the war effort. The Muslim League saw this as a way to curry favor with the British, as well as so there was this sort of spectrum of approaches to the military itself. But what was common was the theme and the idea of not so much as who does the modernization and who does the use, but who controls it and who controls how the military is used. So I think if that answers your question, the one train of thought that sort of flows throughout is this discomfort with the military, but discomfort to the extent that the Indian nationalist elites didn't have complete control over it as a tool or over defense decision making as a whole for the empire, and that sort of followed through. Yeah, but thank you so much for all your other comments as well.
Thank you, Saawani. I think it's also sort of worth exploring the articulation of a sense of Asian solidarity on the part of not just the Indian National Army during the Second World War, but also other independence movements in Southeast Asia. For example, the Indian and the Burmese leaders were very conscious that in the interest of Asian solidarity, they ought not to fight against each other. And that, understanding generally held. And even in the post-independence period, when Sharaf Bose went to Burma in July 46, Aung San, at a reception given to him, was talking about an Asiatic federation in the not so distant future, and so forth. That's one. The other is that a bit of a comparative dimension with what happened in India and Pakistan in the post-colonial period might enrich your paper. So, for example, Muhammad Zaman Kiani, who was the commander of the 1st Division of the INA, has a memoir of his role not just in the INA, but in the post-colonial setup of Pakistan. So those are areas in which your research could productively venture, in my view. So finally, I think I'd like to have Yasser make his comments in response to what has been said so far.
Great, yeah, and I'd like to reiterate what my fellow panelists have said, and thank you all for giving us this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Shil and Professor Bose, for your enlightening comments too. So I thought I'd start with Dr. Shil's comments, and I agree with you. I think that I do have to inject a bit more political economy back into this. So this is an article that I'm revising that's taken from a chapter, and I think a lot of that, even just like a couple paragraphs here and there of the sort of political economic context, I think would be very useful. So I've been sort of struggling with where to insert those and how, but I know I have to take another look at that. I definitely want to have a much more granular look at how this fits into local politics. I think right now the answer is just because I've not gotten a chance to get to the archives again. I just haven't been able to take a look at some of the stuff that would allow me to do so. So for now, that's why that part of the argument is still very tentative. I try and make it in a very tentative way. And I hope it works, at least in that context. In regards to the sort of balancing act between these sort of states and non-state actors and trying to build that narrative, yeah, it's interesting because I think in a large way, part of the argument I want to make with this paper and also the larger project in general is a sort of comment about how these sort of solidarity movements fit into post-colonial nationalism, in the sense of there's been a sort of trend in recent years to try and separate out the sort of heady rhetoric of like your Nehrus and your Zhou Enlais and your Sukarnos versus the more concrete sort of like activism of like non-state actors. But I think there's actually, these aren't two separate forces, at least not in this context, in the sense of China-India friendship. What's really remarkable to me is that it is up until 1959, as things start to deteriorate, the state is very much in favor of it. I mean, it's interesting in that because they're trying to maintain at least some distance from what is purportedly a sort of people's movement, they don't provide the center with much funding. But actually, despite that, they really benefit from the fact that these sort of big sort of social movements from 1954 onwards are not only trying to praise like friendship with China, but they're also praising Nehruvian foreign policy, right? They're basically saying, oh, the Indian state is making its, is putting its mark on the world map here. And I think actually to sort of answer Professor Bose's sort of question of, okay, how do we explain its disintegration? I think in some ways that's how we do it, in the sense of, I think this movement tied itself increasingly as time went on to its vision of the Indian state, and in China too, in the vision of sort of Chinese state building, to the point where when these two states' interests are not in line with each other by 58, 59, there really isn't any resistance that they can muster, right? Because they've tied themselves inherently to this nationalist project as this way in which they sort of make a better world, as this way in which they can channel this internationalist vision, that they're not able to muster much opposition. And when they are, it sort of falls flat. So, I mean, the ICFA, one of the last things that it does in 62, 63, as the war is going on, is to try and create like some sort of march from Delhi to Beijing. But it falls flat because the popular emotion at that point has sort of turned. I mean, it's no longer about friendship or Hindi Chini bye bye. It's about, oh, the Chinese have invaded. So I think that tying transnational politics to nationalism basically, on one hand, both makes the movement very popular in the early 50s, but by the early 60s is what sinks it. And I think that's what I want to try and prove with the dissertation. But thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you very much. I have certainly enjoyed this conference session very much and learnt a great deal from the innovative scholarship of younger scholars. I think we need to enrich the field of the history of political ideas, and that's exactly, I think, what is being done through this conference. Thank you to all of the paper presenters on this panel, and to Dr. Parth Shil for being not just a discussant, but managing time. And do get in touch once you cross the Atlantic. It will be good to have you on this side of the pond, as they say. And many congratulations to Rohit for pulling this together. It's not easy to mount a conference on this scale in the middle of a pandemic, but I think this is the way to survive a major crisis, to continue with our intellectual work. And so let me end with my very best wishes to the younger generation of scholars who are exploring intellectual history of South Asia in new ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bose.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye.
Bye.